Greetings again, film connoisseurs, and welcome to Bibliofilmphilia, the series where we explore what happens when the entertainment we watch becomes the entertainment we read. We are continuing again, of course, in the Ragnarok novelization of Star Trek Voyager. If you remember from Chapter 1, we were introduced to the character Neelix, the local guide who is helping the intrepid explorers aboard the Star Trek Voyager find their way through a galaxy that is completely unknown to them. They are desperate to get home, but they don't know how. The most immediately direct route appears to be through a war zone. But then at the end of the chapter, we realized they were being scanned. Let's continue on into Chapter 2. The scan at the end of the last chapter. What was it? Who is scanning them? Why? Are they going to end up going through the war zone anyway, or will they work their way around? Let's find out. The lights dimmed instantly at the captain's call for red alert to permit the bridge crew to focus more closely on their control panels. Janeway, gripping at the railing, turned to face the operations station. That station was a bay set into the port side of the bridge's upper level, a bay where Ensign Harry Kim stood, almost surrounded by displays and controls. "Ensign, do you read a displacement wave anywhere?" she demanded. "Negative, Captain," Kim replied, as he quickly scanned several panels. "No sign of any other unusual phenomena." Janeway relaxed slightly, relieved but also somewhat disappointed. Once before, the USS Voyager had been scanned by a coherent tetryon beam, and immediately afterward the ship had been caught in a magnetic displacement wave that had dragged it halfway across the galaxy in an instant. The tetryon beam had been used by the caretaker to see whether anyone aboard the Voyager might suit its purposes, and when it had discovered that there were possibilities, though they hadn't worked out in the end, it had sent the displacement wave to fetch the Voyager to its own vicinity. Key plot point, people. The caretaker is what trapped the Voyager in a distant galaxy. Otherwise, they'd know where they are. The journey had been brief and violent, and had left the ship damaged, and several of her crew dead or injured. The vacancies had been made up with the crew of a rebel ship, a Maquis ship, that the Voyager had been hunting, and that had been similarly abducted. It had been a rough ride. And furthermore, the abduction had left the Voyager stranded tens of thousands of light years from home. When another tetryon beam was detected, Janeway's first thought had been that they were about to be hurled back home. When that didn't happen, she was relieved to be spared whatever damage the transition might have inflicted, but disappointed that they were not being sent back to the Alpha Quadrant and the Federation. "Lock our own sensors onto the beam," she began. "I'm sorry, Captain," Ensign Kim interrupted without turning from the sensor console. "But it's gone." Duration was less than 0.4 seconds. "Any sign of a recurrence?" Janeway asked. "A cycle, perhaps?" "No, Captain," Kim answered. "It seems to have been an isolated event." Janeway frowned. "Cancel red alert," she said. The bridge's normal lighting returned, banishing shadows and restoring the usual soothing colors. The captain stared at the view screen for a moment, then turned again to the ops station. Harry Kim watched her from behind his controls, ready and eager, anxiously awaiting her orders. Kim had come aboard the Voyager fresh from Starfleet Academy, thoroughly educated and completely trained, but still inexperienced. Still a bit naive. His rather round Asian face was open and easily read. He hadn't yet learned to mask anything. He knew his job, understood his duties, but hadn't yet learned to anticipate his captain's wishes, to do without being told that little bit extra that would make him a really first-rate operations and communications officer. It was an amazingly bad bit of luck for him to have had his first mission wind up like this, Janeway thought. His parents, back on Earth, must still be in shock at the disappearance of their pride and joy. "Ensign Kim," Janeway said, "I want you to review the ship's sensor records. Find out everything you can about that beam, its waveforms and energy signature, where it came from, what it did to us, if anything, whatever the computers can tell us. I want to know just how closely it matches the Tetrion beam that the caretaker used to scan us." "Yes, Captain," Kim replied, immediately setting to work at his console. "You think that that beam was the caretaker's companion checking us out?" Tom Paris asked, from his place at the forward control panel, a long, curving console that separated the central and lower levels of the bridge. The question wasn't one that the officer at the helm should have been asking, really, but then Tom Paris wasn't really the officer who should have been at the helm. Scandal. Lieutenant Stadi, the Voyager's regular pilot navigator, had been killed during the abrupt journey from the Alpha Quadrant, and Paris, a one-time renegade who had been aboard as an observer, had been appointed to fill in. Paris was an admiral's son, and no one had ever let him forget it, including himself. Janeway was sure that desperate need to live up to his family's standards had been what led Paris to falsify reports, and then later to admit that he had done so, an admission that had gotten him kicked out of Starfleet. He had probably felt that he had nothing left to lose when he joined the Maquis as a mercenary. Janeway supposed, however, that getting caught and landing in a New Zealand prison might have convinced him otherwise. Maybe Tom Paris was the sort who had to hit bottom before he could start back up. If so, Janeway thought he'd done it, there in that prison camp. It hadn't been a particularly harsh environment in a physical sense, but for an admiral's son who had always thought himself destined for command, it must have been hell knowing where he had been sent, and that by his family's standards he deserved to be there. But he was on the way back, Janeway was sure. Ever since the caretaker had grabbed the Voyager, Paris had done his best for Janeway and for the ship. Janeway thought his manners still left something to be desired, though. His question, while reasonable, had the ring of impertinence. And it was a good question. Had that Tetrion beam originated with the caretaker's lost companion? That being had snatched Voyager from the far side of the galaxy, had been called the caretaker, because it had dedicated itself to protecting and caring for a race known as the Ocampa, Kess's race. It had built an immense construction Janeway had, for lack of a better name, called the Array, and had used that construction to perform whatever tasks it chose to undertake, such as supplying the Ocampa civilization with energy, or scanning and then capturing the Voyager. The caretaker was dead now, dead and gone, and the Array had been destroyed to keep it out of the hands of those unpleasant locals called the Kazon Ogla. That left the Ocampa and the Voyager to their own devices. Before the caretaker had died, however, it had told the crew of the Voyager that it had once had a companion, an extragalactic creature like itself, but that this companion had deserted the caretaker and the Ocampa long ago, centuries ago, to wander the stars. It seemed a safe assumption that this companion would use the same technology that the caretaker had used, and Janeway knew of no other source, anywhere in the galaxy, of coherent Tetrion beams. Of course, she didn't know that there weren't other sources either. No one in the Alpha Quadrant had ever developed Tetrionic technology, but the Voyager was not in the Alpha Quadrant. They had already encountered some technology in the Delta Quadrant, unlike anything Janeway had ever seen before. "I think, Mr. Paris, that it might have been the caretaker's companion," Janeway replied evenly. "I hope to have some actual evidence one way or the other when Ensign Kim completes his study. And in the meantime, Captain," Neelix said anxiously, "if I might point out that we are still heading directly into a war zone at incredible speed." Uh-oh. Janeway glanced at the display on the main view screen. The Voyager was, indeed, headed directly toward the Courier cluster, and traveling there at warp 6. But even so, they would not reach it for hours. Plenty of time for Harry Kim to review whatever the ship's automatic systems had recorded about the Tetrion scan. "I'm aware of that," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Neelix." She turned toward the communication station. "Anything, Ensign?" "Not much, Captain," Kim reported. He leaned forward, looking over his control panel at the captain. "I haven't been able to distinguish any identifying characteristics in the beam. There are no resonance frequencies, no interference patterns, no detectable scatter. It's just pure monoparticulate tetryon radiation. That's the same thing we found when we analyzed the computer records of the caretaker's scanning beam, but it doesn't really tell us much. I think that anyone who could project a beam like that in the first place would be able to keep it this clean. Have you located the source? Kim shook his head. I can give you a direction, Captain, he said, but no range. The beam didn't last long enough for us to triangulate, and without any scatter or Doppler effects, well, it could have come from that cluster just ahead of us, or from somewhere back in the Alpha Quadrant, or from anywhere in between, for all we can tell. What direction, then? I'll put it on the screen. A moment later, Kim's diagram appeared on the main viewer. Janeway took one look and smiled wryly. It would seem, Mr. Neelix, she said, that our mysterious scanner lies in exactly the direction that you'd advise us to avoid. Sure enough, if the Voyager were to attempt to backtrack the tetryon beam, it would travel directly through the exact center of the Courier cluster, assuming that they didn't come across the beam's source before they got that far. Janeway looked around the bridge at her command crew. Her first officer, Chakotay, was seated in the right-hand chair of the two set below the rail that divided the upper level of the bridge from the central. He sat there, impassive, calmly awaiting her decision. She knew that he would not hesitate to argue if he thought she was making a disastrously wrong choice, but that he trusted her to do the right thing. He had been the commander of the Maquis ship that the caretaker had abducted and that Voyager had been hunting, but he had seen the necessity of joining forces, and in the end had sacrificed his own ship to make sure the awesome technology of the array did not fall into the wrong hands. Now he served aboard the Voyager, replacing her own dead first officer, and he served very well, accepting her authority as captain, but never being slavishly obedient. If he had some strong objection to her plans, he would say so. Tuvok, the Voyager's security/tactical officer, was in his station at the starboard end of the upper level, a bay that mirrored the operations bay. He was as calm as Chakotay, but he was a Vulcan. He was always calm. His serenity was a racial characteristic, where Chakotay's was a sign of his trust in her competence. Tuvok had been with her for a long time. He, too, knew when to speak up. Paris, at the helm, was studying his controls, only glancing quickly at Janeway now and then. She thought he was trying to hide his eagerness to venture into danger. Janeway knew the threat of alien warships didn't worry Paris. If anything, he was looking forward to testing his piloting skills and his courage against them. Tom Paris, the Admiral's son, clearly still felt he had something to prove to himself, if not necessarily to anyone else. Harry Kim, on the port side in operations, was visibly nervous and was trying hard not to be, or at least not to show it. He wanted to be as fearless as anyone. That was part of his vision of the ideal Starfleet officer, an ideal he desperately wanted to live up to. But he had enough imagination and common sense that he couldn't help thinking just how nasty the situation might get if the Voyager ventured into that cluster. Neelix, down near the view screen, was nervous and clearly didn't care who knew it. Janeway guessed that he thought venturing into a known war zone was insane. But he'd seen enough of human behavior, of her behavior, specifically, that he knew she was considering it anyway. And Kes, up by the gray door of the turbolift, was watching them all, fascinated. She probably hadn't given the possibility of death and destruction ahead of them any real thought. She was too interested in observing the people around her to worry about herself. All but Kes undoubtedly had their own opinions as to whether the Voyager should follow that tetryon beam into danger or avoid the Courier cluster, but none of them were arguing with Janeway about it. They knew the decision was hers. Surely, Captain, you aren't going to risk all our lives and your lovely ship just to see where a scanning beam came from? Neelix asked. I'm afraid I am, Janeway replied, reaching the decision everyone had known she would reach. Mr. Paris, take our heading from Ensign Kim's analysis of the tetryon beam. We will attempt to follow it to its source. Aye, aye, Captain, Paris answered promptly, his tone almost gleeful. But, Captain, Neelix began. Janeway looked at him silently in the eye. And the little alien stammered and then fell silent. She almost felt sorry for him. It was true that there was no point in taking on a native guide if you ignored all his advice, but Neelix didn't truly appreciate the situation here. If the Voyager didn't find a shortcut of some kind, most of her crew, perhaps all of her crew, would be dead of old age before the ship reached Federation space. That assumed they didn't crack under the strain and kill each other first, and that the Voyager could survive that long without proper maintenance. It was worth taking a few risks, even a few large ones, to avoid any such fate. Neelix merely wanted to survive and to enjoy his life, and he was perfectly content aboard the Voyager, with a comfortable berth and plenty of food and water and Kes at his side. He wasn't interested in going anywhere in particular. Janeway could hardly fault him for that, but for her own part, she wanted more, much more. She wanted to return home, to see her lover, Mark, again, to see her crew safely back to their families. It was worth taking a few risks for all that, but not foolish ones. She looked to starboard. "Mr. Tuvok," she said, "I want long-range scanners operating at full military readiness, with shields and phasers on standby. If we're entering a war zone, I want to be ready for anything. It's not our fight, but the locals may not realize that." "Aye, aye, Captain." "Very good, Mr. Paris. Give us warp 7. The decision made, Janeway sat back in her chair and watched as the image of the Courier cluster expanded to fill the screen before her. That is the end of Chapter 2. So, to recap, the scanning beam that we noticed in Chapter 1 turned out to be the same technology that was responsible for originally transporting them far across the galaxy beyond anything they'd ever known. But it's a rare, unusual technology. Desperate to find a way back in good time, they're following what they know of that beam. And it may lead them right into a deadly war zone. Find out what happens after this when we read Chapter 3 next on Bibliophilia.